The new Idaho 4 book came out today, and to me, the introduction is already raising a bigger question. Not just what evidence exists, but how did that evidence become a story the public was expected to trust? Hi, my name is Stina. Welcome back to my channel, or welcome if you're new here. I started reading the new Idaho 4 book, Broken Plea, today, and I was so excited and am so excited. It's so well written. And I'm probably going to cover it chapter by chapter as we go forward with videos and everything. But I don't want this first video to be just about the announcement that I have the book, because the introduction is already doing something worth analyzing, in my opinion. It is showing the difference between evidence and the story built around evidence. So already, just in the intro, is doing that. And this is important because in a case like this, the public usually does not receive raw evidence. We receive a sequence. We receive an arrest. We receive official statements. We receive prosecutor summaries. We receive selected images. We receive a lot of media coverage, typically. And eventually, in this case, we received a guilty plea. But none of this is the same thing as watching the evidence tested in front of the jury. That is the distinction I want to start with. In a high-profile case, an arrest is never just an arrest in the public imagination. It becomes part of the story. It tells the public the state found the suspect. The danger has been identified. The danger has been contained. The system is in control to calm the public down. And to be clear, I am not saying that is automatically wrong. In a quadruple homicide case, of course law enforcement is going to treat the suspect as high risk. Of course the arrest is going to be serious. And of course the public needs some level of reassurance. But reassurance is also narrative. When the public sees a dynamic entry arrest, which means breaking the windows and doors and everything down to arrest that suspect, official confidence, charges, press conferences, and a mugshot, those things create an impression before the evidence is ever tested. They create a feeling of certainty. And once the public has that feeling, it becomes very hard to mentally return to the word alleged. That is one of the biggest things I'm watching in this book. Not just what evidence exists, but how public certainty was created around that evidence. And one thing that immediately stands out in the opening is the timeline around the DNA and the arrest. Publicly, the DNA story often sounds very clean. There was DNA on the sheath, apparently. Investigators connected it through a trash pool at the family home. That pointed to Koberger. Then he was arrested. But the book complicates that by putting the DNA back into the larger investigative sequence. There was surveillance. There was the cross-country trip. There was the family home. There was holiday timing. There was a trash pool. There was rapid DNA testing, I'm saying within a day or two. And then there was a dynamic entry arrest. That sequence matters because if investigators were already tracking him, already knew the vehicle, already knew who his father was, and already knew where the family home was, then the trash pool does not feel like a random breakthrough out of nowhere. It becomes part of a larger procedural story. And that raises fair questions. Why that timing in particular? Why do they use that method? Why wait until that point? And how does that step get presented to the public as part of a clean path to guilt? Now, I want to be very clear. I am not saying the DNA evidence is fake. I'm not saying that the trash pool was automatically illegal. And I am not saying the arrest was improper. Trash pools can be legally allowed under certain circumstances, and a suspect in a quadruple homicide would obviously be treated seriously. But when a story gets compressed into DNA linked him, and then he was arrested, the public may lose sight of the procedural choices underneath that evidence. The route to the evidence is one of the most, I would argue, is the most important thing. The timing also is important. The public presentations as well. So when surveillance, a trash pull, a rapid DNA result, an arrest warrant, and a dynamic entry all happen in a tight sequence, the public does not just receive information. The public, we receive momentum, and momentum can feel like proof. That brings me to the plea. The book opens with the plea and the prosecutor's assertions about what happened. A plea narrative does not work the same way as a trial narrative does. In a trial, the state has to prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt. Witnesses can be cross-examined. Timelines can be challenged. Experts can be questioned. Evidence can be pulled apart in public. But in a plea, the story becomes much more compressed. The court needs enough of a factual basis to accept the plea. That does not mean every unresolved question gets answered. It does not mean that every piece of evidence gets fully explained. And it does not give the public the same kind of tested narrative we would have seen at trial. So yes, the plea gave the court a legally sufficient story. But that is not the same thing as giving the public a fully coherent explanation. Legal sufficiency is not the same as explanatory coherence. The author also points to media framing. One example is the selfie. Do you remember the selfie of Koberger from the morning of the murders, where he's taking a picture in the mirror, giving himself a thumbs up? That image has been shown in media coverage in a way that can make it feel strange, chilling, or psychologically revealing. But according to the book, his phone reportedly contained many other similar photos, him giving thumbs up in the mirror. And that context matters, because if one photo is isolated from the larger pattern of similar behavior, the audience may attach more meaning to that image than the image can actually support on its own. So think of this, if it was put up alongside many other images and they started with that, would that have made a difference? I would argue that yes, it would make a big difference. We wouldn't have treated that picture as so condemning of Brian Berger. So, yes, the photo may be real, and it probably is, but the meaning changes depending on the frame around it. That is narrative framing. Fact can be real and still be narratively loaded. And this is really the lens I'm bringing into this book. I'm not here to ignore the evidence. I'm here to look at how evidence gets arranged into a story. Because every true crime case has a narrative. Police create one. Prosecutors create one. Defense attorneys create one. Documentaries create one. Creators like me, other creators, we create one. And the public often receives the compressed version, not the messy one. So for me, the question is not only, is this evidence real? The question is also, what meaning are we being encouraged to attach to it? And does the story built around the evidence actually explain the evidence? That is where this book immediately becomes interesting to me, because the introduction is not just saying, here are the new details. It is saying, look at the gap. The gap between the official version and the physical questions. The gap between arrest optics and tested proof. The gap between legal closure and explanatory closure. The gap between a plea narrative and a trial narrative. There is one detail from the introduction that I am not going to fully unpack in this video because I think it deserves its own discussion. But the author described aspects of the scene that raise questions about positioning, possible staging, and whether the simplified sequence actually fits the physical evidence. And that is where this gets much deeper than just, he pled guilty, so the story is over. Because yes, the plea ended the trial process, but it did not end the analysis. So this is where I'm starting with the book. The plea gave the court a legally sufficient narrative, but the introduction is already raising the question of whether that narrative was coherent enough to explain what actually happened. And as I keep reading, that is what I'll be watching for. Not just the evidence, but how the evidence becomes the story. So if you're reading the book too, let me know what stood out to you in the introduction. And if you want me to keep going chapter by chapter, let me know that too, because I think this book is going to open up a much bigger conversation about evidence, legal closure, and narrative framing in true crime. The plea ended the trial. It did not end the analysis. Thank you for visiting with me today. See you next time.